Anyway folks, what we might do now is wander down this way and have a look inside the machine shop. This was in its day one of the most substantial engineering workshops in Australia, and I believe that the best trained and qualified tradesmen in Australia worked in these machine shops. Cockatoo Docks and Engineering were very proud of the fact that when they built a ship, every single part of that ship was built on this island.
Recognised as one of the finest deep-water harbours in the world, Sydney's Port Jackson encompasses several small islands, most important of which is Cockatoo, site of the oldest dockyard in Australia. Established in 1838, its history covers the whole period of the colony's development, and it has played a vital role in both peace and war. The island of 44 acres is owned by the Commonwealth, but leased to the Cockatoo Docks and Engineering Company, and the major proportion of work carried out is for the Royal Australian Navy.
If people in Sydney generally think anything of Cockatoo Island, they're probably associated with the building of ships, the repair of ships, and the repair of submarines. But it was much more than that.
I was here for 50 years. My father was here for a couple of years. My grandfather, John Wiggins, was here for about 4 or 5 years.
We lived here 29 years, including bringing up our children.
I really enjoyed every year I had here.
Cockatoo Island is very significant because it has so many layers of history, and so much of that history remains on the island.
On a visit, the landlubber's eye for ships is almost inevitably distracted, for a time at least, by reminders of the past. Cockatoo was considered as a safe place of custody for lawbreakers, being surrounded by deep water and under the eyes of authority then based at Sydney Cove. Brief as this enforced tenancy was, their labours have left much of interest for the historically minded.
In 1839, convict work gangs were brought up here from Goat Island, which had been converted into a munitions storage centre. And the convicts were put to work quarrying the rather lovely yellow sandstone that's found on this island for public works projects like Semicircular Quay. And one of the first public works projects they built was in fact their own jail. And the prison was in fact designed, I believe, for about 340 prisoners, but at some stages we know there are over 550 men in this jail. The prison was exclusively for second-class convicts. These were men who'd committed a crime since being transported to Australia. The prison was not a place which lent itself to rehabilitation because the old lags were put in with the young ones, and many of the younger prisoners learnt the bad habits of the old convicts. But one of the few positive aspects of the prison was that men were trained to be stonemasons here, and in fact probably some of the most or best qualified stonemasons in the colony were trained here in Cockatoo Island prison.
One person who escaped from here was Frederick Ward. Now, Frederick Ward later became a bushranger, and we know him as Thunderbolt. When he was imprisoned here, he managed in 1863 to escape with a friend, and they swam to shore. But his accomplice was drowned, and Frederick Ward was the only one to manage it to shore. And he was met by his lady friend, Mary Ann Bugg, and together they rowed off, and he made a career for 6 or 7 years as a bushranger, was finally shot at Uralla in northern New South Wales.
This is a good example of a major convict construction on Cockatoo Island. In the 1840s, the colonial authorities decided that it was essential to have a dock in Sydney to dock and repair the ships of the British Royal Navy and other ships in the colony. And they decided to build a dock on Cockatoo Island. Construction of the dock began in the 1840s, but it wasn't completed until 1857. It was named the Fitzroy Dock, after the governor of the day.
Another project which the convicts here undertook was the construction of 17 underground grain silos. And this one here is a good example of them. They were about 8.5 metres deep by about 6 metres wide, and they were used to store corn and wheat in. In fact, probably about several hundred tonnes of corn and grain was stored in the 17 silos here, and they were used from about 1839 to 1841. And they were excavated in the shape of bottles, all the work being carried out using hand tools, as no machinery was available in those days. When the silos were no longer used after 1844, they were then converted into underground water cisterns.
When the prison was closed and the prisoners were removed to Darlinghurst Jail, a couple of years went by, and in 1871 it was set up as a reformatory and a place for wayward girls, a safe haven, a place to encourage them to rehabilitate. It was hoped to give it a better feeling in the community, so it was given the name Biloela. But of course, the buildings weren't suitable, and it just wasn't a good place for girls to feel comfortable. It didn't work.
A similar institution was created for the boys. It was the brainchild of Henry Parkes, the father of Federation, and what he had established here was in fact a converted sailing ship called the Vernon, which was anchored off the northeastern end of the island. The Vernon had about 550 boys on it. Some of these boys were orphans, others were petty criminals or juvenile offenders, and the boys were taught seamanship skills. In the early 1890s, the Vernon was replaced by another converted sailing ship called the Sobraon, and the boys continued their training on this vessel.
By the 1870s, it was becoming clear that the Fitzroy Dock was too small. It was possible to lengthen it, but it was too shallow, and to take it out of service would have taken far too long. So a decision was made to build a new dock here on Cockatoo Island, and this dock, the Sutherland Dock, was completed in 1890. And when it was completed, it was, for a short time, the largest graving dock in the world. Not only did we repair ships, we built ships, and shipbuilding started here in 1870. And between 1870 and 1910, there'd been a couple of hundred ships built here. They were only small ships usually. They were tugs and barges and dredges, but a large number of small ships were built. It was a very active shipyard. The big change at Cockatoo came when the Commonwealth bought Cockatoo Island in 1913 to become the first naval dockyard of the new Commonwealth of Australia. With, of course, the start of World War I in 1914, the dockyard became very busy. There was a program to build the cruiser HMAS Brisbane, 3 destroyers, and an enormous program of conversion of ships into transports to carry the Australian troops overseas. By 1919, when the dockyard was busy converting those ships back for commercial service, there were some 4,000 people working here on Cockatoo Island. The pumping station at the western end of the Sutherland Dock was built during the First World War as a pumping station for the docks and a power station for the island, which was desperately short of electricity during World War I. The old switchboard, which is the largest open-fronted DC switchboard left in Australia, is still there. Some of the old DC rectifiers are still there, and much of the atmosphere of the old power station remains.
My father was a naval architect, and he came to work here and live here. As a young boy, I think I was about 11 years old at the time, when I came up and saw this house for the first time, and that was my home for the next 20 years. Well, living here, it was very hard not to be influenced by engineering and the marine field. And I found out years later that my mother had organised my life to be a bank clerk or something or other, and she was horrified that I took on naval architecture when I became of the right age.
The children found it very special to live here. I've learnt in recent times that they got up to a lot more mischief than they ever admitted to at the time.
An interesting thing took place in this building during the early years of the Depression, around 1931. They brought in a design team from former RAAF aircraft designers, and this design team was led by a man called Lawrence Wackett. Now, Wackett installed his team in this building here, and they designed and built aircraft here on Cockatoo Island. They did design a 6-seater twin-engine plane called the Kodock, short for Cockatoo Docks, and that plane was actually commissioned for Charles Kingsford Smith. He was going to start up a little airline between Australia and New Zealand, but because of the Depression, he ran out of funds, and that scheme never really took off, so to speak. When Wackett's team could not get enough aircraft design work to keep his organisation going here on the island, he started to design and build high-speed recreational speedboats and also high-speed ferry boats. But because of the Depression, Cockatoo Docks and Engineering dispensed with his team's services in 1934.
In the early 1930s, with the Depression grinding industry almost to a halt, the Commonwealth leased the yard to private enterprise, the company which today has a proud record of achievement behind it. With the progressive easing of economic stresses, Cockatoo Dockyard gathered strength. One of the notable visitors, the graceful liner Wareamah, with no thought of the wartime fate ahead of her. A wartime personality, HMAS Bataan.
I christen thee, Bataan, and may God bless you.
Bataan eases down the slipway after those traditional words as spoken by Mrs. Douglas MacArthur. During the Second World War, Cockatoo was the only dockyard in the Southwest Pacific capable of major operations.
By 1942, this island was the main ship repair base in the Southwest Pacific, and the work really peaked in late 1942, early 1943, with major repairs to several damaged American cruisers. They included the cruiser Portland, the Chester and the Chicago. But perhaps most dramatic of them all was the repair to the cruiser New Orleans. She had lost some 50 metres of her bows to a Japanese torpedo in the islands, steamed backwards to Sydney, and was docked in this dock to have a temporary bow put on before she could steam back to the United States for permanent repairs. So it was a very active time in 1942 and 1943. Well, after the Second World War, the government decided that it should maintain a naval shipbuilding program in the interests of defence. This really began at Cockatoo with the construction of the last riveted destroyer built in the yard, the Tobruk. After she was launched, the dockyard began the construction of the Voyager and the Vampire.
At Cockatoo Island, Sydney, Lady Slim, wife of the Governor-General, launches Australia's newest destroyer, the 3,500-ton Vampire. The destroyer, which will pack the punch of a light cruiser, goes down to a perfect launch. She'll join her sister ship Voyager, and soon Vendetta, the third of their class, will be launched.
These ships were the first fully welded warships built in Australia, and the largest welded ships that had been built in Australia up to that time.
I had great pleasure in fitting out Vampire, and I still get great pleasure in seeing her still afloat down at the Maritime Museum.
This long program of naval construction began to come to an end in the early 1960s, and the dockyard tendered in competition with other Australian shipbuilders for the construction of merchant ships. We were unsuccessful with most of these, but one we weren't, and that ship became the largest roll-on, roll-off passenger ship ever built in Australia, and at the time ever built in the world, the Empress of Australia. I remember going into the offices of the Australian Shipbuilding Board in Margaret Street in Sydney and picking up the envelope of the first plans. In the ferry, I couldn't resist opening it and looking at the general arrangement, and I thought at that time, we're going to build that ship, and we did.
Built at the Cockatoo Island Dockyard in Sydney Harbour, the Empress of Australia was 17 months under slipway construction. A total of 2,000 men were to work on her before the vessel was completed. The seams in the Empress of Australia are all welded, but the frames are riveted. Give or take a few, there are 250,000 rivets in the ship.
You were part of family in those days. The directors of Vickers had come out from the UK, and they'd see familiar faces when they were walking through shops, and they would stop and talk to them. And you just felt as if you was wanted.
It took time to really feel that you belonged at Cockatoo. I think this was because so many people had been here for so long, and their fathers had been here before them, that there was almost an extent of a Cockatoo family, and that anybody who started here was a newcomer. I thought it actually took about 20 years before I really felt that I was part of the Cockatoo scene in that sense.
Well, I was about 16 and a half when I started my apprenticeship. When I came over, I intended to build wooden ships, not thinking I'd ever finish up as a steel ship constructor.
I started as an apprentice fitter and machinist, and the apprenticeship term when I did my apprenticeship was 4 years, so I was here from 82 through to the start in 86. Well, you had to be on your toes. There was no back chat to your tradesman. A tradesman was someone that you showed immense respect, and if you didn't, well, you'd soon find out about it.
Cockatoo's always been a very big trainer of apprentices. I started here as an apprentice draftsman in January 1960, but we trained people in many trades. In fact, virtually every trade which was involved in our industry, we trained here at Cockatoo. I would say that we probably trained many thousands of young men and a very small number of young women here at Cockatoo after World War II.
While the ship is building on the slipway, the main propeller shafts, including a spare, are turned, the stabiliser auxiliary machinery is manufactured, the rudders are fabricated and machined, everything is being built that goes to make up the complete vessel.
January 18th, 1964. To ready her for the water, workmen hammered away the timber balks that supported her massive frame. Now she was held by a single strand of steel.
I name this ship Empress of Australia. May God bless her and all who sail in her.
It was in the 1960s that the Australian government decided to buy some submarines for the Australian Navy of the Oberon class from Scotland. And a decision was made that Cockatoo Island would be the main refitting and repair base for those submarines. It's appropriate perhaps because submarines began the work of the Commonwealth Naval Dockyard here when AE1 and AE2 were docked in 1914.
All right, diving now, diving now. Diving now, diving now.
Each time one of these submarines leaves the dockyard and dives to prove its many and highly complex systems, the lives of 63 men are on the line.
And from 1971 through to 1991, the refit and support of the Oberon-class submarines was the main reason for being for Cockatoo. That was our principal workload. We completed 16 major refits and many mid-cycle and intermediate dockings of these submarines and many other short-notice repairs. The submarine refits are a very major task. They lasted for about 2 years and involved over 1 million man-hours of effort. And basically it was a job to take the submarine apart and restore it at each refit to as new performance and reliability. Because with a submarine, there are no half measures. It has to be right, and it has to be right all the time. And that was our job. In the 1970s, we were rather desperate to get some shipbuilding back into the dockyard, and we finally succeeded in getting the contract to build a replenishment ship for the Royal Australian Navy. And in 1980, we began the construction of HMAS Success.
I'd never seen a large ship launched before, and it was a hell of a big day. It was a huge event, and the management underestimated the number of people that were going to turn up. And in fact, there were still people left on the wharves after the last ferries headed out to the island. And the island was packed with literally thousands of people.
The launching day for Success was a very proud day for me. I was very nervous, as one could well imagine. In fact, I'm not sure who was more nervous, Lady Stephen, who was to name the ship, or me. But we got through most of the ceremony until it came time to name the ship. I gave the scissors to Lady Stephen, and she named the ship Success and cut the ribbon.
I name this ship Success. May God bless her and all who sail in her.
It took 13 goes to break that bottle.
You take the scissors and let me help you.
It was a bottle of Great Western Imperial Reserve that I'd bought personally at David Jones at Bondi Junction. It must have been safe to dive to 1,000 metres, I think. But the angle that it attacked the little metal plate we'd welded to the bows of the ship had changed overnight as the ship had settled and moved a bit on the ways. And it wasn't until we'd bashed that plate flat that that bottle was going to break. And if anything is ever going to go wrong in the launching of a ship, please may it be the bottle, because that is the least significant of all the events that happen on that day.
17,000 tonnes sliding down the slipway at 20 mile an hour, it's quite thrilling. And everyone just stands back and watches this massive lump of metal start to come to life.
It's like coming alive. I think the American poet Longfellow got it right. He must have seen some ship launchings before he wrote, "She starts, she moves, she seems to feel the thrill of life along her keel, and with one exulting, joyous bound, she leaps into the ocean's arms." It's a perfect description. And in 1986, we handed that ship over, the biggest naval vessel ever built in Australia, one of the biggest ships ever built in Sydney, and the first ever to a French design, and she served the Navy well ever since. In the end, success turned out to be the last, because it was around that time that the Navy were reviewing the future of all their dockyards, including Cockatoo. And it was a result of that review that the government decided in 1987 that they would not renew our lease when it expired at the end of 1992.
You asked me what Australia's lost. We've lost that great training ground for young Australians. When you did an apprenticeship at Cockatoo Island, you didn't work with just 3 or 4 tradesmen. You came across the paths of thousands of tradesmen and picked up a little bit of knowledge from a lot of them. And if it wasn't in the workplace, you'd still pick up knowledge in the lunchroom just hearing stories.
To my mind, it was an integral part of Australia, that it was the main centre of technology of building of ships.
And not only for ships. Cockatoo was a major engineering establishment right from its earliest days and made a major contribution to the development of infrastructure in Australia. There are parts of the Snowy Mountains scheme that were built here, dam gates for flood mitigation schemes, steam turbines that were repaired for power stations throughout Australia, New Zealand and Fiji. Every piece of coal that is blown into the furnaces in the New South Wales power station at Bayswater, Eraring and Mount Piper is pulverised in mill shells that were built on this island. Cockatoo has had a part of the action right throughout Australia. Even the boilers that heated the old Parliament House in Canberra were built here on Cockatoo.
The convict-built buildings are remarkable. The docks, the 2 docks, the Fitzroy, the first dock and the Sutherland Dock, are extraordinary. The early industrial buildings are priceless, but the intangible cultural heritage is what happened here. And I think that's something that somehow we have to explore ways of communicating that to the people of Sydney.
I see potential there now to keep everyone happy. There's plenty of open space for those that just want to use the island to have a picnic on. There's plenty of things that can be restored to keep the historians happy, and there should be plenty of space there for marine industry to start up, albeit on a smaller scale, to train young Australians.
I think a future for Cockatoo is one of the biggest challenges that the Trust faces. It's a very special site. It has important aspects of Australian history still evident on it, yet it needs some future use which provides a link to that history. I think that's a most important consideration, and I would like to see some kind of maritime use of those parts which are appropriate, which maintain the link to the Dockyard's history, which provide the opportunity for Australians to visit the island and see what it is and what it has been, and provide a use for this remarkable piece of land which is of value to the whole of Australia.